Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. 2025 was a tense and violent year in the Middle East and North Africa. But this new year looks set to be even more challenging and more dangerous as Donald Trump trashes the old world order and presides over the birth of a new order which proclaims that might is right. I'm delighted to have Aslı Aydıntaşbaş back on the podcast. Aslı is a fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute and the director of the Turkey Project. She's also a senior associate fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, the ECFR. Aslı, welcome back and thanks for launching the first Arab Digest podcast of the new year.
Hi, Bill. Great to be here. It's become a bit of a tradition to start the new year with you. Always a pleasure to have a fun conversation. And it always seems to be a busy time.
Oh my goodness, you've hit the nail right on the head. Now, although this is called the Arab Digest podcast, I am going to begin because I simply have to ask you about the extraordinary rendition of the Venezuelan president and his wife this past weekend. Forget about international law, national sovereignty, a rules-based international order. Donald Trump threw that all out the window, and the world is left reeling. I know I'm reeling, but what do you make of it? And what does it presage for the remaining years of the Trump presidency?
Well, you're right. The year started out fast, and whether you're focused on the Middle East or some other part of the world, you just cannot avoid talking about this very significant symbolic event because it does feel like the sort of final coffin in the nail of international law. I'm not even saying rules-based order because, there were questions after Russian invasion, Russian occupation of Ukraine, and then the Gaza stuff we talked about, whether or not international law was being, violated. And of course it was, but this is a new level. It's a new level because of the way this happened. Because of the surprise and the entire narrative around it. Here I'm sitting in Washington, and the administration has been framing this, primarily Donald Trump and several people around him has been framing this as sort of as almost a justified imperial grab, naked imperial grab, I would say. We need that. We need the oil. We need to have access. This is our hemisphere. There has long been a discussion in terms of what Trump's foreign policy is. And some people have thought, it turns out optimistically, that new U.S. foreign policy was based on the idea of restraint, and America First was essentially all about, restraining U.S. impulses, not getting involved in forever wars, focusing on domestic stuff, and so on and so forth. Well, this has just shown us that Trump does not have necessarily a consistent foreign policy. And if he sees something he can do, and in this case, grab, he'll go for it. It is also very important because it has implications, far-reaching implications for Europe, for European security, for Greenland, the Arctic, even for Taiwan Strait. And so, we can talk about what it means and the tone around it. And of course, the sort of what it can mean for the Middle East. But one thing that's clear, Europeans are fretting today. They are almost panicking because one of the immediate implications of this more assertive, more interventionist U.S. position will be Greenland. President Trump come out and said before, in his first term, later on, early over the last year, and now since Venezuela, we need Greenland. I want Greenland, he's saying. And it's not clear that Europeans have many options on the table to deter him, or the options they have, they may not be willing to go because they're so vulnerable when it comes to Ukraine and European security and energy needs. So having essentially instrumentalized European dependency on US for its security and energy, I think Donald Trump will be pushing over the next 3 years for Greenland. So As to what that means for the rest of the world, your guess is as good as mine. What are the lessons for China? What are the lessons for Israel? What are the lessons for other countries that want to have a, sort of a sphere of influence, a zone of influence? One thing that is clear, President Trump, who started out as a restrainer with big proclamations about ending forever wars and so on, is now comfortable with use of military force. We have almost a trigger happy United States right now.
Yeah.
That will mean stuff for Iran and other parts of the world.
Yeah, I agree with you completely on that, Asla. And I was thinking, as you said previously, he seemed to be a man that was averse to war, but the more adventures he entertains, the more he seems to enjoy the idea of using the massive firepower of the U.S. to get what he wants. And I think about this interview that Stephen Miller did with CNN.
Oh,
Jake
that was
Tapper. Yeah,
incredible.
wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
And he said essentially, might is right. This is the real world now. We will take
Yeah.
what we want, and we will use our military to do that. So, wow. But look, let's get back to the Middle East because there are momentous events there in the past week or so. I want to ask you, first of all, about Yemen now. The separatist Southern Transitional Council, which is backed by the United Arab Emirates, making a bold breakaway move. The Saudis are very angry. They've struck back with airstrikes. They've used a proxy force, the so-called National Shield, to reportedly take back some of the ground lost to the SDC. Has Mohammed bin Zayed, the boss of the UAE, overstretched himself and misread how his Saudi counterpart, Mohammed bin Salman, was likely to react?
Clearly, I think there are instances in which we can say UAE has overstretched its hand, and Yemen is definitely one. Sort of the whole notion of this Spartan small country that can punch above its weight and size all around the world and the Middle East and so on. So I mean, UAE does certainly have a very interesting and capable diplomatic machine and interesting strategies, but it clearly has gone above its own capabilities and has been a bit too reckless with regional alliances and partnerships. And what we're seeing with Saudi Arabia now, what we're seeing with Turkey, we've already seen that with Turkey in the previous, 2018 to 22. And now, once again, the emergence of a situation in which regional powers are telling UAE, you've gone too far. I think this is going to be a trend. I think we're going to see a similar pushback against UAE in Sudan. I think also as regional powers seem increasingly worried about Israel's emergence as a new hegemon, UAE is risking being isolated as the only regional country that's sort of more squarely behind Israel and Netanyahu policies, because we're already seeing Saudis, making a very clear point that they are not going to push ahead with normalization with Israel as long as the situation in Gaza remains what it is. And perhaps the most interesting phenomenon that of this past year has been the emergence of a new Turkey-Saudi alignment on some regional issues, including on Israel. So, that is something United Arab Emirates would need to reconsider. It cannot take for granted the notion that Turkey is isolated and Saudis and are largely on the same wavelength as UAE is. I think they risk taking these positions for granted. As for the Trump administration does not care about Yemen or Sudan or the other conflicts in the region, but it does care about managing the sort of rivalries among its own allies. And I think to the extent that it pays attention to these conflicts, it would be about de-escalation between UAE and Saudi or UAE and Turkey. So
Yeah.
it is important.
Yeah, and of course there's already a lot of tension between the Saudis and the Emiratis over issues about the economic push that Mohammed bin Salman is driving forward, how that might threaten the Emiratis. There's tension over oil. There's lots of places where there's been existing anxieties, but this has seemed to really be a case where Mohammed bin Zayed has misread. I mean, he's a very astute guy, but in this case, I agree with you. I think he's misread the situation. The Saudi response has been very tough and firm, and it seems to be having some effect. And as you say, perhaps the message is being relayed to the Emiratis in Washington. Hey, this was not a good idea, and we want you to pull back a little bit. Well, we'll see on that one. But look, you mentioned Israel. Israel became the first country in the world to recognize Somaliland, which has stoked speculation that this impoverished country in the Horn of Africa will become the dumping ground for Palestinians ethnically cleansed from Gaza. The Horn is already smoldering, Asli. Is this a case of pouring petrol on the fire?
It is a case of pouring petrol onto the fire, as you have really laid out the entire dilemma in your question, Bill. But this is sort of, the region is already in turmoil. There are more conflicts and more deaths, casualties occurring than we had in the previous decade. So it's not like the region is stable. And on top of that, I think this is seen as a revisionist move by many regional players, including, once again, Saudi Arabia, including Turkey and several other countries. So Israel's move, whether it is intended to create a sort of a new axis, capture a strategic part of the Horn, in the Horn of Africa, or whether it's actually intended as a snub to Turkey. That is also a possibility, which has because Turkey has very close relations, of course, with Somalia. So whatever the cause is, I think we are seeing a regional reflex, a bit of a pushback. And I think regional countries are starting to think that Israeli moves are going too far. You know, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Horn of Africa. I also saw this through the prism of Turkish-Israeli rivalry, regional rivalry now, going outside the borders of Syria and spilling into Africa, and we're already seeing it in Eastern Mediterranean with Cyprus. I know you want to talk about Turkey and Israel, but I just want to flag this situation again. It's not something the Trump administration cares about, but they do, in the sense that it pits their close allies against one another. I think certainly a space to watch in terms of the Arab Digest and the work you've been doing on the Horn of Africa.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Trump grabbing Venezuela the way he has is a signal to other countries. Well, you know what?
Sure.
Let's do it too, and to hell with the consequences. Yeah, you've touched on civil war in Sudan, and here again, the UAE has played a major and most would say highly destructive role in supporting the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, as it conducts its own genocide in Darfur. Now, this is a war that the world has pretty much chosen to ignore. Do you see any way in which this brutal conflict, which is currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis, is there any way, Asli, that it can be brought to an end? And if so, what needs to be done to make that happen?
So, Bill, there are allegations of genocide. I need not say anything further, and it's the worst humanitarian crisis we have right now, and very little international attention on what's happening in Sudan. We already have various Middle Eastern powers, supporting different sides in this conflict. So it is something that Trump administration needs to pay attention to. They're not. But maybe this provides a space for Europeans to do so with their own diplomatic capabilities and sort of using UN and their dialogue with regional powers. Are they doing it? Not really. I mean, unfortunately, Europeans have not used the past couple of years to develop sort of a regional muscle for geopolitical Europe. They have all the right slogans on strategic autonomy, emergence of a geopolitical Europe, and so on and so forth, but they don't seem to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. So one hope I have is for Germany and France and other regional countries to start paying attention to Sudan, if for nothing, for the kind of destabilizing effect it's going to have on the region and on migration, which always, of course, seems to grab Europe's attention. But we'll see if they can refocus their energies on what is going on in the region, what is a terrible, terrible, brutal situation in the region.
Yeah, and of course, Europe is just completely, as you
It
said
is
earlier,
sad.
yeah, it's, oh my God, he wants Greenland. We've got to focus on that. And what are we going to do about Ukraine? So, but
I mean,
somewhere in all of that, there should be, you're right, there should be deep concern about Sudan. And the Americans aren't interested. Trump doesn't care, but Europe perhaps should.
Europe definitely should, and they should also have the confidence to delve into regional conflicts that are in their immediate neighborhood. I'm not talking about Taiwan. I'm talking about Lebanon. I'm talking about Sudan. I'm talking about Libya. They've done some stuff on Libya, but primarily followed Turkish or U.S. lead, and so this is an area in which they can build diplomatic muscle and address the humanitarian crisis, their convening power, and so on and so forth. They've got to be rethinking their own, their own size, right size European power in terms of its economic and military heft. Yes, they may not be able to fight Russia, but they certainly can have a say over Sudan. But, will that happen? I don't know. I'm skeptical, Bill.
Yeah, I join you on the skeptical side of the equation for sure. Let's move back to the Levant and your assessment of the situation in Syria. And I'm reminded the last time we had you on, you talked about the al-Sharaa regime, which found itself caught between Turkey and Israel. Now, that situation would appear to have become entrenched. Is that how you see it, Asli?
Yes, I mean, Syria has become a battleground in the rivalry between Turkey and Israel. And you and I spoke about this. It has pretty much continued to rage on over the past year, making it difficult for the new regime, new government in Syria to stabilize its borders. Essentially, its southern border is controlled by Israel and northern border is controlled by either the Kurds or Turkey. And while, the world has given al-Sharaa some credit in order to stabilize the country and govern, it's not provided the new government with the means to do so. The sanctions on Syria have just recently been lifted. Up until a couple of months ago, basically 2 months ago, they were still in place. And I think that, the Trump administration, while in support of the Sharaa regime, has not done the kind of hand-holding it needs to do in terms of providing them with the help they need on governance aid, on sort of legal frameworks, and in managing the Turkish-Israeli rivalry. I'm hoping that there is an understanding here in Washington that that is an immediate concern. I hear now that there is going to be a greater focus from the Trump team on Turkey-Israel rivalry, and either to push them for a normalization or for some type of a detente that provides a breathing room inside Syria. But this is very dangerous stuff still, because, while Turkey, there's multiple elements to it. There's Israel's policy of mowing the lawn, that is to say, keep a military dominance over their neighbors, Lebanon and Syria and so on, and Yemen and so on and so forth, to make sure that Israel can strike targets that they see as threat when they want to, and they've been doing that in Syria. And there is the fact that this is seen as a direct threat and a destabilizing move by Turkey, another big sizable power that wants to exert its own zone of influence, at least control and zone of influence over Syria. And there is the reality that Syrians, meanwhile, are actually being super pragmatic, and they want to manage these conflicts. They want to reach a deal with Kurds. They are trying to make this whole thing work, but they have limited means. They have limited capabilities. What Syria needs is not just conflict resolution framework. They need governance aid. They need help in terms of coming up with a new legal framework for the kind of country that they want and we want, which preserves, some sort of a multi-ethnic Syria that where minorities can live in relative peace. I think the people who are running the country need help on that. I don't think anybody is doing that. And on top, of course, there's the whole investment and so on and so forth, the economic element. But that's not going to happen until Syrians figure out how they're going to preserve the kind of fragile peace they have domestically now. A very important component of that would be, of course, the kind of relationship that central government is going to build with minorities, Kurds and the Druze, and even Alawite communities on the coast. But all of those discussions are now part of the Turkish-Israeli rivalry.
Yes,
Turkey
indeed.
or Israel has hands they have hands in different pockets of what's happening in Syria. And so once again, Europe, I don't mean this whole conversation to be about Europe, but this is the one thing they know. Like, they've helped countries in their transition from the Soviet bloc. They've helped countries in the EU accession process. This is an area in which there could be more governance aid and legal aid and sort of, how do you set up municipalities? How do you set up a national dialogue? How do you set, but again, Europeans don't seem to feel Syria should be a priority.
Well, I suppose we can take some solace in the thought that the Trump team may engage in this particular area.
They certainly do. They certainly do.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about the Israelis who continue to violate ceasefires in Lebanon and Gaza on a daily basis. The IDF acts with impunity in conducting its genocide in Gaza. The West Bank is being ethnically cleansed by settler thugs. More and more illegal settlements being greenlighted by the Netanyahu government. So will Trump's trampling on international law not further the extreme prejudice with which Israel is colonizing large chunks of the Levant?
Yeah, what's happening in the West Bank is absolutely heartbreaking. And it's happening in real time, before our eyes. I mean, this right after the Gaza genocide. I actually applauded President Trump for pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza and really bringing parties together and pushing Israel towards sitting at the negotiating table with Hamas. But unfortunately, the process there is not moving on from phase one, which is the cessation of hostilities, to phase two, which is establishing a permanent governance and security structure there. So on top, we have what is happening in the West Bank and now Lebanon. I think the idea of disarming Hezbollah is important and something that many Lebanese agree with. It's been, Iranian influence in Syria and Lebanon has been destabilizing and not something populations have embraced. On the other hand, it's not been easy, and I think the Lebanese government is caught between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that, yes, they do seem to want to move forward on that, but there's a domestic dynamics, and there is, the threat of further Israeli action in the country. I think on this issue, Turkish-Israeli normalization, which I expect we might see some movement on that in the first 6 months of this year. I think Turkish-Israeli normalization might be helpful, as in helping government of Lebanon, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, perhaps helping the government of Lebanon, supporting them in taking some of these steps, or shielding them from further military, incursions and actions. But again, an interesting space to watch here.
Yeah, and I think again your point about Europe missing in action on this front as well. And
Totally.
you're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Brookings Institute's Aslı Aydıntaşbaş. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to receive our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. All right, now we've been talking about Turkey. President Erdogan, does he see opportunity in the chaos that's now cascading onto the region and indeed the world? Is this time for him to make a move?
So, Bill, you and I have been talking about Turkey's ascendance as a regional power and how Erdogan has built a new narrative on Turkey as a regional hegemon. The century of Turkey has been his election platform and his slogan, and Turkey obviously has had an activism beyond its borders, including its military presence in Libya and Horn of Africa and Qatar and so on and so forth, and the Caucasus, and it wants to be a big guy in its neighborhood, and that's all fine. But I think things are now getting to a place that feels so chaotic that Turks are starting to feel that they are out there on their own. Yes, President Erdogan has a good relationship with Donald Trump, but you don't need to be an expert on international relations to know that President Trump is not necessarily the most reliable ally when it comes to defense and security issues. And I think Turkey is looking at the world map with a war in Ukraine, war in Syria that just ended but could restart, the Kurdish situation and on which there's a peace process, but it's not clear that it's going to move forward, in Lebanon and the region and Africa and China. And they're feeling that they need security partnerships. And the one place they want to go is Europe. But that train seems to have left the stations. There's a case to be made for a Turkish-European marriage, would be a too strong a word, but a Turkish-European detente and convergence and a realignment, particularly when it comes to European security, post-Ukraine war, Black Sea security, defense industrial production. Turkey has a robust homegrown defense industry and so on and so forth. But it's not easy. It's not happening. It's not happening because Turks have expectations and Europeans have expectations. And it's, while it makes sense for Turkey and Europe on some very rational realpolitik level because of the baggage from the EU accession process, because of Turkey's human rights record, because of the presence of Cyprus and Greece, the two countries that are more skeptical of Turkey, Europeans cannot get to a deal with Turkey. So I think Turkey is looking at this map and the kind of global chaos and what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening with Ukraine. And they worry about Russia. They worry about implosion in the Middle East, and they worry about instability among great powers. So it worries me in the sense that domestically, Erdogan has been rather authoritarian and is able to crush domestic dissent and so on. But I think externally, he is feeling increasingly vulnerable.
So a little more caution on that front.
A little more caution. Also on the Erdogan-Trump bromance. Yes, it's there, but Turkey is not able to use that to its advantage in terms of securing its own borders yet.
Yeah. Well, and as you say, I mean, the thought that Europe should be looking at Turkey once again, because honestly, Europe needs alliances. America
Absolutely.
has made it absolutely clear their position on Europe, and now may be the time that some pragmatic thinking does take place in Europe and in Turkey. And as you suggest, perhaps that may be a road forward. But my goodness, we're going to have quite a year in 2026, Asli.
Well, I guess this is going to be a very chaotic year. It started off with chaos, with the Maduro kidnapping, or Maduro, whatever we call it technically.
I think
What's
kidnapping
happening
is a good way to describe
is
it.
a good technical legal term. But I think for many of our listeners, there'll be a lot to talk about. Also, a lot of anxiety in terms of this sort of commotion and movement and constant feeling of chaos and out of control international politics. I think the least we can do is to keep talking about it, and to hold on to our families and friends and community, and the community that you have built around your podcast, Bill, and just sort of to remind each other that we're at least there for one another, to talk, discuss, and really try to grapple with these huge dilemmas and problems.
Yeah, a big challenge, but we will keep talking, Asli. And I thank you so much for taking time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's been a pleasure as always.
My guest today was the Brookings Institute's Aslı Aydıntaşbaş. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East, North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. With all that's going on in the world and the huge challenges independent media is facing as the US tilts towards authoritarianism, we need your help. We need your support. Head to the website, arabdigest.org, and look out for the offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.